Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 287. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, October the 8th, from the James Strong Studio in western St. Charles County. Today's essay is going to be on the long-form podcast. And you think to yourself, well, what the heck is the long-form podcast? Friends, it's what you're listening to now. The podcast is something, actually a podcast is something that's fairly new. Maybe the last 10 years, certainly the last 5 years, they've become very popular. And a podcast, just for definition, a podcast is different from a traditional interview, a traditional story in that it takes longer to explain because there's no breaks, there's no commercial messages, there's nobody waving a stick over your head saying what you can say and what you can't say. And it's more information, it's better information, it's more thorough and complete information than we've ever had an opportunity to receive before. But if that's the case, why is there so much misinformation around here? Okay, I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the responsibility of being a podcaster, the responsibility of putting the right information out there, the responsibility of anybody who sits behind a microphone, myself included, who they have a responsibility to not just tell the truth, but especially not lie. And most important, to be able to differentiate and explain the differences between fact and opinion. I'm going to go over that in detail, and it includes a podcast that I listened to this week, which is a perfect example of this long format type of podcast that I'm talking about. And as part of that podcast, as part of that explanation, I'm going to talk about, I traveled again this week. So briefly, I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of travel and what happened this week, okay, and how travel has changed, maybe some for the better, maybe some for the worse, but again, giving you, dear listeners, an idea of what you're in store for when and if you decide to get back out there and travel again on a fairly regular basis. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the news on the war in Ukraine. What's going on over there, surprisingly, is not getting a ton of press. And when I say that, sure, there's a story here or there all the time. This happened, this place was bombed, these people did this, those people did that. But I'm talking about the detail. And if you think about the fact that there are very few people alive who remember the last time there was an active war in Europe, okay? There's just not a lot of people that were alive in 1945. Or I'm going to say you basically had to be born before 1940 to remember World War II, because I don't think many 5-year-olds out there remember World War II. So you had to be born before the 1940s. In other words, you've got to be at least in your 80s, okay? Younger than your 80s or older than your 80s to remember World War II, okay? But there's an active war with possible nuclear ramifications that's going on in the Ukraine. And something has happened over there that is just, to me, it's bizarre. It's beyond the fray as to how this whole war is going on. Because if you think Russia, who by most standards has the number 2 army in the world, both in terms or mainly in terms of advanced weaponry. Russia is the second largest supplier of weapons in the world, second only to the United States. There's a lot of countries who buy their stuff. If you look just on the sheer geography, compare the size of Russia to the size of Ukraine, this should have been a walk in the park for Russia. It's not. It's been going on since February. And not only are the Russians not advancing very quickly, but recently they've been getting their clock cleaned. In fact, I'm going to talk about that, and a lot of it has to do with the weaponry that's involved, okay? In fact, captured and abandoned tanks by the Russians. In fact, it's funny because I asked this question of several people, and nobody gave me the right answer. And I didn't expect them to give the right answer, okay? Here's the question. I'm going to ask this to you, dear listeners, and I want you to answer it yourself. Okay. Who is the number one supplier of advanced weaponry to the Ukraine? Most everybody says the United States. A few said a few said Poland. Some said the EU, but most said the United States. Well, it's not the United States. It's not Poland. It's not the EU. In fact, if you combined all the advanced weaponry given to the Ukraine, if you combine everything given by the U.S., Poland, Germany, all the EU countries, all the other countries combined, they do not come close to the weaponry from the number one supplier of advanced weaponry to Ukraine. That supplier, that number one supplier, Russia. That's right. Captured Russian weaponry is the number one supplier to the Ukraine army. And I'll give you an example. Tanks, for instance. Tanks that were supplied to Ukraine by everybody else, 320. Tanks captured from the Russian troops, 421. 101 more tanks were captured from the fleeing Russian troops than were supplied to Ukraine by all of the allies combined. Infantry fighting vehicles, 210 have been supplied by everybody to Ukraine. Vehicles captured and turned around and used against the Russians, 445. Quick, do the math, Strong. That's 235 more. Armored fighting vehicles. Ukraine has been supplied 40 by all their allies. They've captured 192. Now, the only thing that they're not supplied more by Russia is multiple rocket launchers. They've been given 70. They've only captured 44. Okay? But that is just, to me, is just an amazing, amazing number. In fact, captured and abandoned Russian tanks, howitzers, fighting vehicles, quickly scrubbed of their tactical Z markers and repainted with Ukrainian crosses, are being turned against their former owners as Ukraine's military advances in the eastern part of the country. Now, Ukraine's rapid breakthrough in the Kharkiv region a month ago ended up by putting hundreds of pieces of Russian armor into Kiev's hands. That's according to military officials, as the Russians just left behind their heavy weapons and warehouses of supplies and weapons in their disorganized retreat. Now, some Russian pieces of equipment were ready for immediate use. Others did have to be repaired and then returned, but some of them, they just got in them and started driving them. Tanks, vehicles, and guns too damaged to salvage, they're being cannibalized for spare parts. Now, crucially, Russia has also left behind large quantities of Soviet standard artillery shells. And that's good because the Ukraine had darn near run out of ammunition. Now they've got more because they took over the warehouses where the Russians just left their ammunition. Now, this haul is helping power Ukrainian forces as they retake parts of the eastern Donetsk region, that includes the town of Lyman, and push further east into other nearby regions. Now, the Kiev government has regained more than 4,000 square miles of land over the past month, in addition to advances in the south. One Ukrainian battalion, the Carpathian Sich, seized 10 modern T-80 tanks and 5 S-25 Gintsink self-propelled howitzers after it entered the town of Izium last month. That's according to the Ukraine Deputy Chief of Staff. We've got so many trophies that we don't even know what to do with them, he said. We started off as an infantry battalion, and now we've become a mechanized battalion. The chief of staff of a Ukrainian artillery battalion says that his unit now operates 4 recently captured Russian 2S-19 Miska 152 millimeter self-propelled howitzers alongside the American guns that they have, and they now have abundant Soviet caliber ammunition. In fact, the Russians no longer have a firepower advantage. We've smashed the artillery units before launching the offensive, and then we started to move ahead so fast they didn't even have time to fuel up and load their tanks. That's according to one of the Ukrainian officers. They just fled and left everything behind. Now, combined with weapons taken during the Russian retreat from Kiev and other parts of northern Ukraine in April, these recent gains have turned Moscow into by far the largest supplier of heavy weapons to Ukraine, as well ahead of U.S. or any other allies in sheer numbers, and that's according to open source intelligence analysts. Western provided weapons, though, are usually more advanced and precise. However, Ukraine has captured 460 Russian-made battle tanks, 92 self-propelled howitzers, 448 infantry fighting vehicles, 195 fighting vehicles, 44 multiple rocket launching systems. That's huge. Now, all their gear is not cutting edge. In fact, what they captured is a mix of modern equipment that they can use effectively and some that belongs in museums. That's according to a Ukrainian official. Now, Russia has also seized some Ukrainian weapons, mostly in the early days of the war, as it overran large parts of the country. So, sure, Ukraine has lost some, but they've gained far more than they've lost. At the Battle of Izium, Ukraine gained more advanced Russian armor, like the T-90 tanks and the BTR-82 infantry fighting vehicles with automatic cannon. Now, the commander of Ukraine's 92nd Brigade, which played a major role on the Kharkiv front, was filmed this week taking a ride in a T-90 tank, which wasn't part of Ukrainian arsenal before the war. That's one of Russia's top tanks. Now, Western allies haven't sent Western-made tanks to the Ukraine, but Kiev has received 230 upgraded T-72 tanks from Poland and a few dozen from the Czech Republic. American and European aid focused on providing Ukraine with NATO standard precision artillery, like the M777 and the Paladin, the German Panzer Hobby 2000, and the Russian Krab howitzers, as well as, most importantly, the HIMARS missile systems. They've got 16 of those. Now, those weapons allow Kiev to hold the line once it started to run out of Soviet-caliber artillery shells in May. And that's not a problem anymore because they've captured so many more. Now, while Ukrainian units often keep smaller captured weapons and ammunition, big-ticket items such as tanks and artillery are usually redistributed through the military's logistic command. But even then, they usually stay in the same area, which is only fair. You guys captured it, you guys keep it. The Carpathian Sikh, for example, that was the division we talked about earlier, transferred to other parts of the military, captured howitzers, and kept the tanks, which you could find crews for. Now, the battalion commander said these tanks have now been formally allocated to the unit and are regularly supplied by the military logistics with ammunition and fuel and serviced by visiting crews of Ukrainian tank plants. Ukraine was a major tank manufacturer and exporter during the war. So they know these tanks because they built them with the Russians. Now they've captured them and they're using them. Unbelievable. This whole war is very, well, it's being fought in Europe. It's affecting the world economy. It's a big deal. But this thing is going to have long repercussions for a long time. The best thing that could happen tomorrow is to have Putin be done, okay? However, and that has to be done internally. The Russians have to decide, look, we're done with this guy. We're putting somebody new in. And they put somebody in that's that makes the right decisions and makes the right things, pulls out of Ukraine, gives these people back their country, and then offers to pay for all the damage that they've done. They can do that by pumping tons of oil back to the West and taking a portion of those profits and paying to rebuild Ukraine. If that happens, it's going to take decades for Russia to get back to where they were a year or so ago. Decades. But that's the only chance that they have. We'll see if that happens after all. Okay, into the essay, the long form podcast. And actually, I've started the essay right now. In fact, I've just pontificated for over 15 minutes on a long-term or a long-form essay on Ukraine, on what's going on. Many of you may not have known that. And why is this unique? Because what format do you let somebody talk uninterrupted, uncensored, for 15 minutes on one topic? It doesn't happen. Not on radio, not on television, only on podcasts. And in a room with your buddies, okay? So this actually was part of the long-form podcast essay. Part 2 of this, I'm going to talk a little bit about this trip that I was on, okay? Once again, I've traveled on business. I went to the East Coast, and I traveled via American Airlines again. So I flew into Philadelphia, and American Airlines and Southwest both serve Philadelphia with multiple flights a day. So normally when I go to Philadelphia, I'll fly one way via one airline and the other airline on the way home, mainly because while they all have about the same amount of flights into Philadelphia, the times are scattered. So this time it was easier for me to fly to Philadelphia via American and home via Southwest because just of the scheduling, okay? Prices were about the same. But once again, second time in a row, American Airlines has really, really stepped up. The flights were on time. They were clean. The flight attendants weren't snarky. I got upgraded to first class, which always helps. So what do you get in first class? On a CRJ Bombardier aircraft made in Canada, you get a seat that's a whole lot roomier, which is most important. But also, you get some snacks, you get extra coffee, you get extra attention. It's just a whole lot nicer, okay? You're up to the front of the plane away from the engines, so it's quieter. You're right next to the bathroom, which if you're drinking all the coffee, that's kind of necessary, but all kinds of good things. And I got bumped up, so that was a good thing. How are things on the East Coast? Well, I was in Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey this week. Gas prices higher than they are here, but certainly cheaper than they are in California. A buddy of mine sent me a text looking at, what was it, $6.70 a gallon or something like that that they're paying in Los Angeles for gasoline. Yeah, $6.50, $6.70, something along those lines. I forget what it was. That's unbelievably stupid. That's more than twice of what we're paying here. And even on the East Coast, prices are higher here. But Delaware, what were they? I think they were like $3.29 a gallon in Delaware. That was gasoline. New Jersey was about $3.59. Pennsylvania, I paid $3.85. So certainly higher than in the Midwest, but certainly not as high as California, which makes no sense. I have no idea why they're the way they are, but they are, okay? But the weather was difficult there as well. They were getting the effects of Hurricane Ian, which just decimated southwest Florida and up through the coast and even hit the Carolinas after Florida. But that was making its way up north. It had basically run out of steam, but we didn't get heavy winds. We didn't have tons of rain. I mean, it rained, but it was, as I call it, hurricane rain, that fine stuff that you get. It never stops, but it never gets real heavy, and it's almost like a very heavy mist. The drops are small, okay? But it was 48 degrees and rainy all the time, okay? At least on Tuesday and Wednesday. By Thursday, the hurricane was done. The weather The sun came out. It got a little nicer. But the weather was just, well, it was autumn. How's that? The main reason for going, I was seeing customers, again, in Delaware and New Jersey and Pennsylvania. But in the Philadelphia area, there's an area that I go to. When I go to Philadelphia, I see and call on customers in a town called King of Prussia. And you may have heard of this town. The reason being is there's a big mall. At one time, it was the largest mall in America. I think Mall of America in Minnesota may be bigger. King of Prussia Mall is at least, I mean, I don't know how many stores are there. It's huge, but it's a big destination. King of Prussia Mall is one of these places where people actually get on an airplane, fly into Pennsylvania just to shop at this place, okay? If you can imagine it, the store, it's there. And one of the things about the East Coast, okay, that's different than here, is the diversity of the population. Now, diversity is everywhere, okay? You have all shapes, colors, national origins, religions everywhere in this country, okay? It's not as opaque as it used to be, but you go to the East Coast and it's very cosmopolitan. If you can imagine it, that person is there from that background, okay? And so as you go through this King of Prussia Mall, and I walked it one evening, as you go through this King of Prussia Mall, there are shops that we don't have here. There's shops with nothing but Eastern African clothing. And this is not for your progressive white leftists who want to dress like Africans. This is for people who live here now from East Africa and they want to go ahead and dress like they used to, okay? There's 2 shops that I saw that cater to Muslim women. And when I say that, I mean, it's a shop where you go into and you buy stylish hijabs, you know, the head wrappings that Muslim women wear. It's a high-end store. I mean, it's it's high dollar. And these stores wouldn't be there unless they had a large clientele. There's stores that have all kinds of ethnic foods that you buy. They have stores that have all types of ethnic furniture and ethnic clothing, ethnic cookware, ethnic everything, stuff that you're not going to get at Macy's, because if you came from Pakistan and you now live in the U.S., there's some things over there that you just can't get over here because of a culture difference, okay? They've got stores for that in the King of Prussia Mall. They've got kiosks in the middle of the mall that are little convenience stores, okay? And you see those everywhere, okay? But here they're different because it's not a French fry stand. It's not a kebab stand. It's a stand where they have packaged food from someplace else where you can't get this brand of food there. Case in point, if you all of a sudden decided you're going to live in Azerbaijan, okay, you're not going to be able to buy Hostess cupcakes. You're not going to be able to buy Lay's potato chips. You're not going to be able to buy Breyer's ice cream, okay? They don't have that over there. But if you lived over there, wouldn't you kind of want that stuff just because a taste of home? That's what they have over there. You can get the equivalent of Lay's potato chips or Breyer's ice cream in these little stands, stuff that you're used to, stuff that you grew up with, stuff that you buy as a treat when you go to the mall. It was very cool to me, and it's been a long time since I've been to that mall pre-pandemic. So about 3 years since I've really been to that mall, and it truly has changed. The one thing they did have next to the mall that I don't understand is they have a gasoline station. And actually, this gasoline was a whole lot higher than any place else. It was $3.99 a gallon, where every place else was between $3.85 and $3.89. So it was at least 10 to 14 cents a gallon higher than anywhere else. The station was Lukoil, Lukoil. And you think to yourself, well, what's the big deal with that? Friends, Lukoil is owned by the Russians. Now, I don't understand why it's still open. I don't understand if we have all these sanctions against Russia, why we allow a Lukoil filling station to remain open in eastern Pennsylvania. That being said, the 2 times I drove past it, there was nobody buying gas in there. Absolutely nobody. It was closed. Well, I mean, it was open, but nobody was buying gasoline there. Why it's still open, I don't know. Why it's going to stay open, I don't know, because I didn't see anybody buying gasoline there. But I found that very interesting as well. Some of the things that did happen, however, while I was there, these places are still throwing dopey fees on top of everything that they do. And I've mentioned this before. I mean, I am a dyed-in-the-wool, true-to-form Hilton fan. I love Hilton hotels. And I would say that in many cases, they've lost their way during the pandemic. I think they're getting better, but they lost their way overnight, and they're just barely now getting better. Now, and what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, hotel room rates have gone way up, okay? I'm spending $160 a night on a hotel. I used to spend about between $120 and $130 a night on these hotels. So they've gone up $30 to $40 a night. That's a lot. That's 30% increase almost, okay? Between 30 and 40% increase. And I get it. Okay, inflation, but we don't have 40% inflation, okay? And in addition to that, they don't clean the rooms every day, so you don't have the staffing. Hilton got rid of the free breakfast, so they don't have that. Yeah, they give you a little bit of a credit that covers some of the breakfast, but they give you $10, and breakfast was $18.50. Yeah, $18.50 for breakfast. So they still charged me $8.50 for breakfast, and breakfast was 4 eggs, 2 sausage, some yogurt, and an orange. That was breakfast. It wasn't anything fancy or special, all right? $18.50 used to be free with the room. But the other thing that they did, which to me is unforgivable, and I say that because you know the room rate before you book it. They tell you they're not going to clean your room in between stays. They tell you you don't get a free breakfast anymore. So you know all that going in. So if you know all this going in, you can make the decision to stay there or stay somewhere else. But at least everything is on the table. Everything is out front. Everything is clear as can be. Here's what bothered me. A $2.26 parking recapture fee. That's what they called it. Parking recapture fee. And you don't get it until they email you your receipt after you've left the hotel. So I thought, parking recapture fee, what does that even mean? Let me go back. Okay, again, to be fair, this place always had free parking. Maybe they don't have free parking anymore, so let me go back to their website. So I went back to their website, and it says free parking. Okay, if it's free parking, why'd you charge me $2.26 for a parking recapture fee? So I called the hotel and asked that question. I said, why did you charge me for parking? You're supposed to have free parking. Oh, no, sir, we didn't charge you for parking. That's a parking recapture fee. I said, it says parking and it says fee. Yes, sir, but it's a recapture fee. I said, well, what does that mean? They said, well, it costs us money to maintain that parking lot. Friends, this is a 300-room hotel that was full. Okay, so take $2.26 times 300, okay, which is what they charged every room. Let's do the quick math. That's $700, $700, almost $800 a night that they charge or get for this parking lot recapture fee. I'll make you a deal. $800 a night. I will maintain your parking lot for half that. $400 a day, and I'll maintain your parking lot. I'll sweep it. I'll clean it, which, by the way, it wasn't swept or clean. It was filthy. And there was a panhandler who walked around every car that pulled up asking for money. So it was just a fee to fleece the clientele. That has to stop. If you want to charge more money, bump the price of the room up another $2.26. Don't try to charge me something after I've walked away. Because me being what I am, is I argued with the guy and he took the fee off the bill. Okay? Which still made me mad. It didn't satisfy me. Nobody won this argument because they didn't get their Dolby recapture fee from me. Their guy had to spend time arguing with me, a lifetime Diamond member who has over 1.5 million points right now with Hilton. Sure, I got my fee taken off, but I had to spend time doing it. I had to convince them. I had to sell them on the fact that don't charge me for parking because your parking lot is free, or don't advertise a free parking and then charge me for parking. So nobody won. They didn't get their money, and I'm angry. That kind of stuff has to stop yesterday. Okay, part 3 of the podcast, the long form podcast. And it has to do with a long form podcast that I listened to earlier this week. Those of you who listen on a regular basis know that my podcasts are generally between 40 and every now and then they go over an hour. Occasionally, if I have the Gray Falcon on or somebody who's an exception, they'll go close to 2 hours. But normally my podcasts are somewhere in the 40 to 50 to 60 minute range, okay? That's a lot of talking. That's a lot of stuff coming out of my pie hole, okay? But you, dear listeners, elect to listen to it. And as I've said before, a podcast is just radio. It's radio, the format, not radio, the appliance. And it's a passive media. In other words, you can listen to it while you're doing something else. And during my plane flights and my walks, I listened to a podcast on the Joe Rogan podcast. And the guy being interviewed was Roger Waters, the front man for Pink Floyd. And I actually listened to this podcast on the suggestion, or on the recommendation, I would say, from Number Two Son. He said, hey, you need to listen to this. It's really good. I'm thinking, well, Roger Waters, I mean, isn't he an anti-Semite? Isn't he a pro-Russian activist? And, I mean, that's what I've heard. Okay. Well, my son said, why don't you just listen to the podcast? Now, normally when somebody does that, I don't. Unless it's an individual whom I respect, which Number Two Son, I do. Nothing angers me more than when I get somebody that says, hey, you need to watch this video. And it's an hour and 40 minutes long. I'm thinking, no, I'm not going to watch an hour and 40 minute long video because that takes an hour and 40 minutes and it's out of my life. However, if somebody says, hey, listen to this hour and 40 minute podcast, that doesn't necessarily take time out of my day because I can do that while I'm doing something else. So the long form podcast has become popular because you can multitask. That's the synergy word of the day, folks. Multitask. But you can do that now, okay? And I listened to this podcast, Joe Rogan, who, in my opinion, is the modern day David Frost. He's the best interviewer we have out there. Nobody else is close because not only does he ask the right question, but he doesn't edit the podcast, and he asks a question and actually lets the interviewee answer the question. Now, sometimes it takes 3 hours, but he answers the question. He doesn't interrupt. He rarely interrupts. I'll say that. He doesn't push the interviewee. Okay. And when I say that is, some people say, well, Joe Rogan doesn't ask the hard questions. If you give a guy 3 hours to say what he needs to say, he's answered all the questions. Okay. And this Roger Waters interview was the same thing. Okay. He answered all the questions. And I can tell you that what I've found out, is that Roger Waters is not, in fact, I'll read exactly from my Facebook post. I posted this a little over an hour ago. I just listened to Joe Rogan's 3-hour interview with Roger Waters. Yes, 3 hours. That's a lot of time. But now I know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Roger Waters is not an anti-Semite, and he's not. But he's certainly anti-Israel. He's not pro-Russian and anti-Ukraine, but he's a peace at any cost guy. He's not anti-capitalist, but he badmouths the uber rich while having a net worth of $310 million. Also, he's very sharp and articulate for a 79-year-old man, which is commendable. And also, which you rock and roll fans will appreciate, the dark side of the moon had absolutely nothing to do with the Wizard of Oz. Now, how did I know that? Because Joe Rogan asked him, and he said, look, it has to do something with the Wizard of Oz. You can smoke dope, play the two together, and they just gel magnificently. Roger Waters says, no offense, but that's BS. It has nothing to do with the Wizard of Oz. It's just a coincidence. Now, if the guy that wrote the music says it's not the case, you can take it to the bank. It's not the case. Now, you learn these things when you sit in on a 3-hour conversation. That's kind of what you're doing, too, with a podcast. It's kind of what you're doing with this podcast. You're involved in the conversation, although you're not responding. You're kind of like a fly on the ceiling, okay? And Joe Rogan does provide that format. So if you have time, my recommendation, check out the Joe Rogan podcast. Go to Spotify and search his guests. If you're like me, 90% of them you really don't care about. They don't interest me. The MMA guys don't interest me. His comedian buddies generally don't interest me unless his name is Joey Diaz. But the other 10%, wow, they're really, really good. Joe Rogan caught some grief because, he's on Spotify. He's sold out. He's not on other formats, only Spotify. So you got to go to Spotify now. What do you mean he sold out? He got paid for what he was doing. What's wrong with a guy getting paid? So anyway, that was my take on Roger Waters. And as I mentioned on the Facebook post, he's not an anti-Semite, but he said things he does not like Israel. He thinks Israel is a repressive apartheid regime. However, he said so much stuff. First of all, he said that they're an oppressive oppressive apartheid regime. They're just sitting on the Palestinians, something terrible. And Rogan even asked him, said, well, you know what? But isn't Hamas their government? Isn't Hamas a terrorist organization? And here's what Waters said. He said, well, Hamas is in charge in Gaza, not necessarily the Golan Heights or the areas up near Jerusalem. But he said, you got to remember that Hamas is a freely elected government. They elected Hamas. And besides, when Hamas lobs missiles into Israel, they rarely do much damage. When you do that, you've tilted your cards as to what you think. Now, if you listen to Roger Waters and put two and two together, Israel also has a freely elected government. They also lob missiles into the Gaza Strip. But here's the difference. Their missiles do damage. Okay? If Gaza did not freely elect a government whose mantra is death to Israel, maybe they wouldn't have quite so many problems. Roger Waters damned the United States and every president from Biden all the way back to who knows how far, and called them all war criminals. Called them all war criminals. And he said when George Bush invaded Iraq, he's responsible for killing 100 million people. Well, he's just wrong. Because there's only 42 million people in Iraq and we didn't kill them all, okay? George Bush did not kill 100 million Iraqis, so he's got his numbers wrong. They're just wrong, okay? He consistently said that Christians have free reign in the occupied territories of Palestine. He said that 2 or 3 or 4 times. It can't be Christians because the only Christians in that part of the world or Palestinian Christians, okay? I'm sure he meant Jews. But when you misspeak like that several times, what else did you misspeak on? Okay? With Ukraine and Russia, he's been criticized for saying he's pro-Russia and anti-Ukraine. And I wouldn't say that, except for he did say he's peace at all costs. And peace at all cost is never peace. What he has suggested in open letters to Putin and Zelensky is that you just cease fire right now. Whatever land the Russians taken, just let them keep it with the understanding that they promise not to take any more. And then you're done. Well, it doesn't work that way. It's never worked that way in history. And to believe that it could work that way and that Putin would say, okay, fine, we've only taken this, and so we're not going to take any more, we promise. Didn't he kind of do that with Ukraine? I'm sorry, with Crimea? He's going to continue to take and take. That's just the way these guys work. So peace at any cost never works. Peace at any cost is never a viable alternative. It never has been. Not in the history of the world has there ever been peace at any cost. And here's something he needs to understand, okay? And this is kind of an open letter to Roger Waters. Somebody's going to be in charge. There's always somebody in charge. Who's in charge right now? The U.S. and the West. Are they perfect? No. Are they close to perfect? No. Have they made missteps? All the time. Are they going to make more missteps? Absolutely. But here's the thing. Let's say the U.S. and NATO were no longer in charge. Who would be in charge if we weren't? Well, it would be China or Russia. And to say that, well, how about if we have nobody in charge, is an extreme degree of naivete, because somebody is always going to be in charge. There's always a chief cook and bottle washer. There's always a king of the castle. It's always that way. Somebody's got to be in charge. And if it's not us, it's going to be China or perhaps Russia. So let me ask a quick question. Do you really think the world would be better off if China ruled the roost, Russia ruled the roost, or the U.S. and the West ruled the roost? Is there room for improvement? Sure. Do we need to do a better job? Absolutely. Do we need to do more than just fine-tune what we have now? Yes. Do we need to stop invading countries? Yes. Do we need to stop imposing our will on third world nations? Yes. All that, yes, yes, yes. But somebody's got to be in charge. And if not us, who? Well, that's it. I'm done. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. That's my email address. Send me your email. I will send you a link to the podcast. You can download it and listen to it at your leisure. Please share it with your friends, share it with your family, share the wealth, share the good news, share my Dopey podcast, my long form podcast. I would appreciate it. The numbers are looking good, folks. I appreciate the hard work that you do. And I appreciate the letters and not letters, I guess the emails that I get and the correspondence, and I do answer each and every one of them. That's it. I'm done. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.